Good morning and welcome to the Nationals Conversations at COP28. We are here with a wonderful humanitarian, someone who has worked to give voice to the voiceless and to help those who cannot be here in these grand conferences. He's had a track record in a number of very difficult positions, but he's also been able to bring these stories to you, our audiences, often speaks to the media to try to explain very complex situations. I'm here with UNHCR High Commissioner Filippo Grandi. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
We are holding a series of conversations here at the National during COP28 to try to bring some of these issues to our audiences. But of course, as we meet here, there are a series of conflicts that blight this region, and of course, most importantly, the resumption of the war in Gaza, sadly, the end of the truce. And while I know, of course, UNRWA is ultimately responsible for displaced Palestinians, one of the issues we have is that Palestinian refugees have their own situation. So UNHCR is responsible for all refugee situations except the Palestinians for UNRWA. However, you yourself headed UNRWA, but also importantly speak out as a humanitarian. I want to ask you, what can be done to get us to a point where we can get to humanitarian causes, but also how can we help those on the ground?
Let me just give an important premise. The most important thing here, and I know I'm not saying anything original, is to go back to a peace process, to a real peace process. And the Palestinians have been cast aside in the big geopolitical discussions in the Middle East. This has to change, because what has happened since that horrible 7th of October, these horrible acts by Hamas, and then what has happened with the Israeli military action in Gaza that has already killed thousands of people, including more than 111 UNRWA staff, is the consequence of not having any more discussions around the table.
Right.
And you know, the passage between the table and the arms is unfortunately very quick there. So that's the most important thing. Now, having said that, which of course is complex, is much more complex now than it was even when I was there 10, 15 years ago, because of the expansion of Israeli settlements, because of the fragmentation of the political landscape of the Palestinians. What has happened makes it more difficult, but I think leaders of the world and of the region and of the Israelis and the Palestinians have to have the courage to go back to that table. Meanwhile, of course, we need again that pause, that humanitarian ceasefire, call it as you like, to prevail again, because otherwise aid cannot go inside, otherwise people will continue to suffer, otherwise the population of Gaza, 2/3 of whom are refugees already, will become further displaced inside the Strip, and the suffering will continue. So this is my view as a humanitarian, as you said. You know, UNHCR is not directly involved, but I think as a humanitarian and as a person who has lived there, I have some views about that.
And building on your views, I mean, one other issue, of course, that UNRWA suffers from, but also UNHCR, is that we have these continued conflicts and difficult situations, but under-resourced. We talk often about financing. Of course, we need financing for climate action, but we also need financing for humanitarian action. So I want to ask you, how can that change? What is your appeal to not only governments, but also the private sector that has a role to play?
Yeah, I'll give you one example. I was a few weeks ago in Chad. You know, Chad, a poor country, one of the poorest countries in the world, in the middle of a very unstable region. They have Sudan on one side, Niger on the other side, Libya in the north, so they are not in an easy neighborhood. They have received since the 15th of April, when civil war started in Sudan, they have received almost 500,000 Sudanese refugees from Darfur.
From April?
From April. And they had already many refugees from Sudan, but also from other countries, so they have now more than 1 million people. One person in 17 people in Chad is a refugee. This is a country that is almost at the bottom of the Human Development Index, you know, the measurement of wealth. So we have to help, and we're there. We are. I visited there. We are at the border. We receive people. The stories that we hear from people fleeing Darfur are as bad as those that we heard 20 years ago when the whole world was up in arms for defending the people in Darfur. Who talks about Darfur now? Nobody. We are funded less than 30%. You know, people are piling up in a place called Adre, which is at the border, thousands of them, and we need funds to put them in a more decent place and to give services, by the way, not only to the refugees, but also to the poor Chadian host communities that are sharing small resources. We don't have funding. So I really want to appeal to donors, public, private. We need help. We need help in all the situations that are not in the headlines.
Yeah.
And Sudan is one of them, but also Eastern Congo, many places in the Sahel, the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, Afghanistan. The list is very long. And you know, unfortunately, aid has become very volatile. It focuses on one crisis at a time, and it is more and more difficult. One more point, sorry to be a bit long on this, but you, Mina, mentioned the private sector. The private sector is very, very important, not just in terms of financial contributions, but also technical expertise. Many of these situations, we are at COP, we should say that, happen on top of everything else in very climate fragile settings. Chad is very fragile from the climatic point of view, and many other places. So we need technology, we need know-how, we need expertise in technical areas in which humanitarians do not have enormous experience, but we are gaining it, but we would benefit from that support.
My next question was going to be, well, why are you here at COP28? You've just partly answered that, but tell me about that, the role, for example, for a place like COP28 to bring some of those actors together. What brings you here?
There's a lot of talk you may have heard about what, I don't like that term, climate refugees, right? But we have to admit that we have to say that climate change, the climate emergency that we're all talking about here in Dubai, has also another impact on humanity. It displaces people.
Right.
It forces people out of their homes. I don't like the term because in reality it does that in many different ways. It does that because there are natural disasters, that's obvious. Or because the level of seas rise in low-lying areas. But you understand, that type of displacement is very different from natural disasters. Where we come in more regularly is where climate change generates conflict.
Right.
Deprives poor communities of resources, communities start to fight, and that we've seen it in the Sahel, we see it very frequently, in the Horn of Africa, and in other places as well. So there are multiple relationships between climate change and people moving, call them refugees, call them displaced. So that's why we come in. We come in with our expertise in protection, in responses, but we need to partner because what needs to be addressed is the root causes.
Right.
Of course, then these are the big issues, right? 1.5 degrees, stay within that, reduce emissions, allocate resources for the poorest countries that are the most impacted and the least responsible, and the list is long. These are the foundations of what is discussed here, and we of course support that, but then we want everybody to zoom in also on the challenges of those that are displaced and ensure that they are included in the responses. That's my job here.
So I want to ask you about this point. You're right, this term of climate refugees almost tries to silo off that it's just because of climate change. But as you said, issues sit on top of each other.
Yeah.
It's more complex. How has UNHCR kind of changed how it approaches the issue of climate in the last 5 years or so? And how are you gearing yourself up to include climate as one of the driving factors?
We had to learn. Like everybody else, we had to learn fast to keep up with a phenomenon that is moving very fast and impacting us very fast. So we had to hire people with different knowledge, with different expertise, but more importantly, we had to forge different partnerships, especially with development actors. We do it anyway because this is relevant not only for climate-related issues, but also for education, for livelihoods. Development actors have become a fundamental partner for humanitarian agencies. But then we had to partner also with organizations more specialized in climate issues, in the private sector, foundations, and so forth. So partnerships are key. We had to learn a new type of advocacy, building in the climatic factor. We had to highlight examples of this, or where this happens. Apologies if some of you have already heard me say that, but for example, I always give this example of northern Cameroon. This is a very remote part of Cameroon. It's called extreme north. It's near Chad, by the way, and there's always been coexistence between pastoralists living with animals, livestock, and farmers living on agriculture. When Lake Chad started shrinking, climate change, then these two communities started fighting each other over small things. The farmers were digging holes to collect water, and the animals would fall into these holes. This in a poor area can trigger a conflict. So we have to see things from the perspective of people, not just of big politics. And this is what we had to learn, to advocate for that. That conflict that started killed thousands of people and displaced many inside Cameroon, and many went into Chad. I went to visit them a couple of years ago. These were, but you don't call them climate refugees. You call them refugees, full stop. We never say war refugees or pandemic refugees. We call people refugees if they correspond to certain definitions, and these people do. So it's a lot of work that we're doing, but we're developing the tools. We need help. By the way, one more thing that is very important, maybe sounds a bit small, but not so small. Humanitarian operations in these areas, isolated areas, dangerous areas, are very costly and very big. They have a big carbon footprint. Right. So we are also working to reduce that. And guess what? Who are our main partners there? The private sector. Because they offer us carbon-free solutions on how to support our operations. So that's another, maybe a bit of a niche area, but very interesting for many companies.
We're very fixated often on the challenges because they're huge, especially when we talk about refugees, when we talk about displacement, when we talk about conflict. But also there are opportunities, as you said. So that kind of learning from one another or picking up on the opportunities, how do you recommend, how do you advise international actors to be thinking about what are not only the opportunities but kind of ways of learning from each other's best practice? Because that's an opportunity that a place like COP can give.
Definitely. I think that's what COP is also about. Well, COP is where, let's put the fundamentals first. COP is where our leaders out there should make the right decisions. I'm not so sure about that. I hope they will. But if they don't make those right decisions, all the rest is not very, how can I say, possible. Yeah. If we don't reduce emissions, if we don't change the course of this terrible emergency, we won't be able to solve the problems of those that are impacted at that very grassroots level. So that's the fundamental issue. But in that space that is created by these negotiations, I think that we need to talk about this matter. Talking is very important, advocacy. And of course, as you said, comparing practices. Two things that I think are very important in response to your question. One is that the best practices are compared between civil societies. This is where really people adapt. There's so much talk about adaptation. People adapt. I deal with the poorest people on earth, the most vulnerable. I can see the phenomenal capacity of resilience and adaptation that these people have. So this is where really we need to learn. But of course we must support them. because otherwise it cannot be sustained. So civil societies, and there's a lot here in Dubai talking about this. The other one you mentioned in the beginning, that I'm here also to give, to amplify the existing voice of refugees, of migrants, of displaced people, of stateless people. Well, we have also worked a lot to bring some here, to bring some so that they can talk about the real impact. It's important that leaders listen to that. You know, in 2 weeks' time, actually less than 2 weeks' time, we will have another event. You may think that I also only go to events. No, I also go to other places, but events are sometimes important. And we have a big event in Geneva called the Global Refugee Forum. This is organized by UNHCR, leaders come, ministers, but we have more than 300 refugees that are going to participate. So 10% of the participants will be refugees. And I want them to talk about that. And some of them will talk about how climate has impacted them. I was with a group of refugee climate activists last week. It's phenomenal to hear what they do and what they need. This is what we need to pay more attention to.
So the Refugee Forum, I was going to ask you about that, happening in December, in a couple of weeks' time, is born also out of an effort from the UN at a high-level effort. There was a compact announced on refugees and migration. How much of that has actually trickled down and been effective? Because sometimes, again, some of our viewers, our audience will say, okay, there's great announcements, pronouncements, but how much actually gets implemented on the ground?
I know. Sorry about that. It's difficult sometimes to explain how these big initiatives become real. But I can assure you that the Global Compact on Refugees, you know, there are two global compacts on human mobility that were endorsed by the United Nations, adopted by the United Nations in 2018. One on refugees and one on safe and orderly migration. They're very complementary. UNHCR deals mostly with the Refugee Compact, and another UN organization, IOM, deals more with the Migration Compact. But we work more and more closely because the two phenomena are very closely interrelated. And I can speak more about the Refugee Compact. The way we have designed it back then, in 2018, was to have every 4 years, after that compact was adopted, a forum of all the actors, government, civil society, private sector, academia, faith organizations, sports organizations. It's a big event. It's not just governments. It's much bigger. We call it all of society. And we ask all these participants to make pledges. Pledges doesn't mean I give 100,000, I give 1 million. Sorry. If they do that, they're most welcome. But because we need resources. But what we're asking is really to make pledges in terms of policies, approaches, commitments, and to try to match them. If a country like Chad, let's stay with that example, it does that. It says refugees are welcome here. We are poor, but our doors are open. Then other countries may say, okay, if Chad does that, we will support. We will support its education system. And a lot of that has happened. There were 1,700 pledges back in the first Refugee Forum, 2019, and we will have more and more solid ones and more matched ones at this one. And a lot of those pledges have been realized. I'll give you one example, a big example. The World Bank, the biggest development organization in the world, is now an important actor in refugee responses. It was never the case before. They put in resources and they do things that we cannot do. You know, sustainable energy, building education system. We can scratch the surface with humanitarian aid, but they can provide the sustainability. There's a lot of teething problems in this marriage between humanitarian and development, but through the compact and the forum, we are addressing many of those challenges. So this may seem a bit abstract. They're not abstract things. These are important developments, important progresses that are happening because of these initiatives.
All of what you've said, the development arm, the humanitarian arm, the way we function, the way we work, the way UNHCR works, is rooted and based on having international law that is respected and adhered to. And yet we see time and again that international law is being violated. How much of a challenge is that, and what can be done at a senior level, at the leaders level, at the UN level to change that?
Well, first of all, to endorse what you said, we live at a time when international law is violated with impunity by states and non-state actors. I mean, Gaza is a clear example, right? Kidnapping people is a violation of international law, but also targeting civilian infrastructure like hospitals is a violation of international law. Here you are, but I could give you many other
Sadly,
examples.
list.
This is international law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war. You know, war has laws, as everything else. And in our areas, in UNHCR areas, the part of international law that we deal with, that we're custodians with, is refugee law, is the right of asylum, the right of not being pushed back to where you can be persecuted or killed. So that also is an aspect of international law that is under a lot of pressure. But there I think we need to continue to reiterate the importance of law. You know, states are a bit ambiguous on that. They violate when it's convenient, but then at other times they understand that that is important, so we need to remind them of when they said it was important so that they don't violate it when it is convenient to them to do so. But I think that it's a matter of advocacy, it's a matter of reminding states of their legal obligations. Many of them are signatories of many conventions, right of the child, etc., etc. So this is why also the UN has organizations, each one of which, or you know, even outside the UN, the Red Cross, for example, many of us are custodians of aspects of the law, and sometimes we obtain a positive result, sometimes we don't, but we won't give up reminding all of their obligations.
Any questions? No? Oh, sure. We'll come here and then we'll turn to the gentleman. Oh, okay, thank you.
I am from a European country, and therefore I see that Europe currently is undergoing a difficult moment in terms of how to manage immigration at large. And immigration is broader, if you like, from the refugee, which before being like entitled to be considered refugee have to be, there is a process. Now some countries, including my own country, is considering to outsource this transition from having people coming through Italy, for instance, and to be managed and processed. And I would like to understand if the High Commission for Refugees has a role in facilitating or orienting or making countries, specific countries, make better policies or processing the moment in which immigrants come to a country and then they are processed for their right to be considered as refugees.
Yes, actually it's a very complex question, but if I can just simplify the reply. Number one, I'm unpacking it a bit. Number one, we are against what we call externalization of asylum, because a foundation of the right to asylum is that a person that seeks asylum, an asylum seeker, has access to the territory of the country where he or she wants to seek asylum. So if you eliminate that by saying you cannot seek asylum here, you violate the convention, especially if you are a signatory of the convention, as most European countries are. Then that triggers UNHCR's role. Of course, in European countries, we do not have big humanitarian operations like in other countries because the resources are not needed for that, but we have a presence and we have a role. The Refugee Convention, 1951, stipulates that UNHCR has a supervisory role in the application of the convention. So we have a mandated legal role to remind governments that they are violating and, of course, to offer them solutions on how to address particular challenges, because these things are very challenging. I'm not underestimating that. Then, so that we do that, and we do that all the time. Sometimes we do it publicly. Most of the time we do it as a negotiation with government, because these are complex, and our purpose is not to make noise. Our purpose is to make progress, which is different. Sometimes you have to make noise to make progress, but not always. But there are many different nuances to what you have said. You may know that we have taken a very firm position, for example, in respect of a proposal by the United Kingdom to externalize asylum to Rwanda. That we have taken exception because we thought that that was an abdication of responsibility on the part of the United Kingdom. Italy, which is your country but also mine, has outlined an agreement with Albania of which we don't know enough. The agreement is very much at the political level. We need to see the details. You see, you can send people back to another country if that country is safe, if that country offers, if the people came from that country and that country offers guarantees that it can provide a safe and fair asylum process.
In reality, those who are having to go through these borders are often being facilitated by smugglers. It's being done through illegal methods. They themselves as humans are not illegal, but the method is illegal. But a big part of that is because third country acceptance through the UNHCR system of relocating those who need to go is so minimal. Why don't countries accept their responsibilities and actually help with third-party transfers? And a big example is Syrian refugees who have been languishing for years, Iraqi refugees before that. I know them because it's from the region, and there are many regional examples from around the world that actually, if we could get that safe transfer rather than smugglers making money, illegal routes, why hasn't that been able to be tackled?
I totally agree, Mina, and we've been saying this many times. We need to develop, let me put it that way, smugglers, traffickers, many of them horrible people preying on the suffering of those on the move. Unfortunately, they will continue to exist. It's a big business. They have the space. In many places, they have the impunity. They're not arrested. They're not thrown in jail. They're not tried. So they have the space. So we have to compete. We have to compete. It's a terrible world. Sorry. Don't get me wrong. We have to compete. We have to create alternatives to their mechanism. And one of them, a big one, is to create alternative pathways, as we call it. Instead of illegal ones, legal ones. In the Americas, I was just in Colombia last week. In the Americas, with funding from the US, and I want to give credit to the US administration, we are now multiplying legal pathways, not only for refugees, but also for migrants. Because some of them, as you said, are not refugees. They also have their own rights. They're not under UNHCR's mandate, but if you create legal pathways for them, you reduce the pressure on the asylum channel and you take business away, if I may use this word, from the smuggler. So there are other ways to do these things, but this is an important one. But you know how many refugees are resettled every year? Less than 1%. So of course, it's not competitive. So we need to build that up more.
Okay, we have one question here.
Thank you. Emma Sky from Yale International Leadership Center. I wanted to sort of ask you about the 51 Convention, because that was created at a specific time after World War II. All the things you've been describing now with the context of the 21st century, do you feel there is a need to have a new convention that reflects that? So you've not got all these add-ons or alternative pathways, it becomes the root work of what you do.
The convention is a very big umbrella. If you read it, and it's a very simple reading, it's a short document. I advise people to read it always. It's very actually current in terms of laying out the principles that if you are a person persecuted, victim of violence in a country, and your country, your government cannot protect you anymore, so you go out because you are unsafe, then you become a responsibility of the international community. It's a beautiful concept, totally valid today. And the convention is built on that. And then it talks about access to work, to education, still very topical, still very current. So I would not change the convention. What I would look at is all that has been done to make sure that the implementation of the convention is always made current. That has evolved, because of course you're right, some of the problems we saw in 1951 are not there anymore, but new challenges have emerged. So this is what needs to be, this is the job of my organization. The supervisory role is to adapt the implementation of the convention to realities in the world.
From the viewpoint of UNHCR, what would make you say COP28 is a success? We've done well.
First, the big picture. Let me say it again: the 1.5, loss and damage. The big tickets that are at stake here. Because I think that if those don't advance, nothing else is really possible. All the rest is band-aids. All the rest is struggling to fix a crumbling building, which is nature and our life, the life of humanity in the world. So I'm sorry to be a bit dramatic, but this is fundamentally it.
That's what's at stake.
That's what is the success. Then of course, I hope that that will advance, and we know it will be a mixed picture. We know. We are not born yesterday. We know it's a mixed picture. So within that mixed picture, hopefully more positive than negative, I think that attention to the displacement phenomenon linked to climate will be a big success. I think that's also good, positive. But of course it's not enough. If resources will not be available to mitigate the consequences of climate change over population on the move, to ensure that resources are available under loss and damage for these people, then the success will be, it's not enough to say it, we need also some action. I think it's progressive and we'll keep pushing.
And you've seen so far with loss and damage, we've had momentum, we've had important announcements, so are you feeling a bit more optimistic?
That was
Day
good.
3 of COP.
That was good, it was a good start, and chapeau also to the UAE for pushing that. I saw that other countries have pledged. It's a beginning, we need much more.
Thank you very much. As always, a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your insights. We've heard about the importance of keeping people at the center of not only COP28 deliberations, but all international deliberations, the importance of humanitarian and development work coming together, the role of the private sector, not only in immediate humanitarian, but also skills and that transfer of skills. But importantly, we've also heard about the importance of adhering to international law. So thank you for all your efforts, Mr. Grandi, and thank you all for tuning in and for being with us.
Thank you.